I've been running from it my whole life. It was this kind of black hole that lived inside of my family where, my grandma was a journalist who was broken through Maoist era thought reform. And so she had a mental breakdown, leaving my mom to basically be raised as an orphan by a colonial boarding school in Hong Kong. And so I grew up with my grandmother in my nuclear family once my mom came to the US. And she spent quite literally every minute of every hour of every day rewriting the story of her past because she was trying to re-seize agency. And it scared the shit out of me. And I could see how my mom was still really tethered to the traumas that my grandmother had experienced. And I was being sort of ushered into that same role. And so I ran. And that's kind of when this adventurous side of me started, is I was trying to get away from this story and, ended up working in Antarctica and had this moment of being like, well, you actually can't get further away than this. And this story is still haunting me. And so my family ghost quite literally just told me I had to do this. I was on one of my solo bike trips and was kind of thinking about the fact that a new chapter in my life was starting. I just turned 30 and sort of asked the landscape, okay, if this is done, what comes next? And the landscape answered in a little phrase and said, someone has to feed the ghosts. And I spent the next 9 years following that mandate by making this book. So it was not kind of like, oh, vaguely someday I have to do this, or maybe it would be fun or interesting. It was it was my ancestors sort of grabbing my hands and saying, you have these opposable thumbs for a reason. My grandmother was born in 1927, which was the first year of China's civil war. And she was working as a journalist in Shanghai during the communist takeover in 1949. And so basically the inflection points of her life story lined up perfectly with these just horrific convulsions of Chinese history. And I kind of joke that she's a really meddling ghost because she died in 2012. So she died years before I started this. But the sort of perfect narrative structure that she gave me through the bones of her life story and the fact that after she fled to Hong Kong, she wrote a memoir and recorded all of this. I felt like my job was basically just to follow these breadcrumbs that I had been left. And so essentially what I'm doing is I'm looking at Chinese history mostly from 1927 to the end of the Cultural Revolution and using that history to explain basically the broken structures within my relationship with both my mom and my grandma. Well, I think in a way I was inhabiting the blank spaces because I didn't know these characters. And I think the book was an attempt to know these parts of my mom and my grandmother that had been really inaccessible because of all the ways they never learned to face their trauma and talk about it. So I think that's where I began, is where are the fissures? Where are the gaps? And I've been thinking a lot about the idea of an artist and a historian as someone who is mending the past in a literal way, where you find these breaks in archives, breaks in stories, the places where you only see the myth and you know that you're not getting the full picture. And then you have the ability through your pen to create what isn't there. And that was the process that I followed, of really trying to take the nuts and bolts of dates, places, locations, what happened, and then see where is this not telling the full picture? Where is the human side of it missing? And that was what I tried to draw when I was inhabiting my mom and grandma's lives. I always, because I am equal parts writer and artist, it was always a translation between word and image. And there would be times when I would be drawing fully inked panels, having no idea what the words on the page were going to be or what the rest of the panels would be. And so I think that's where I was relying on the fact that if I was anything before this book, I was a painter. That was my most established medium. And I let the story and the stillness tell me what parts wanted to be words, what parts wanted to be images. And so for a while, I had one of those sort of crazy police detective walls on my studio where I would have all the things that I knew that I was going to weave in. And I wouldn't know if they were going to be text or image. And it would kind of be only as more of the scaffolding as the story came together, I would be able to see how it needed to come out. I think I'm really interested in fissures. I'm interested in cracks. And I think for me, silence is when you come up against something that's too important to speak, if that makes sense. And for me, because I am such a somatic person, and I think my body is much smarter than my mind, and I let it guide me in any any practice that I'm doing creatively, personally, athletically. And so it would be that process of being quiet enough where I was wandering through the landscape of this book where I would find a pocket of silence and it would teach me something.